welcome everybody, and thanks very much for coming to our symposium this evening. I'm very happy to introduce to you Conrad Shawcross and Matthew Watkins, who have been resident here for the last week for a project which will try to draw out the outcomes and the thought processes during this discussion tonight. The project emerged out of the journal Collapse, which Ergonomic publishes, and the aim of Collapse is to bring together contemporary artists, scientists, and people working in various disciplines together with philosophers. The conviction being that philosophy has to be nourished from outside, and that philosophical thought indeed occurs in all disciplines, that whatever you're doing, you encounter philosophical problems and invent philosophical concepts. So one of the features of Collapse has been, since the beginning, extended interviews, and one of the first ones we did was in Volume 1 with Matthew, where he spoke about his work collecting and collating and synthesizing research on what he himself calls the mysterious links between prime number theory and physics. And so it was really a fascinating kind of discussion, and I felt that Matthew was precisely the kind of broad-minded thinker who would fit into this notion of Collapse being a transdisciplinary journal. Then much later on, last year, I worked with Conrad on a piece for Collapse 5. What interested me about Conrad's work and what fed into this project really was the fact that Conrad was working with scientific and philosophical concepts, and he was in effect materializing these concepts in works, and I was interested in the way in which that made something which was very abstract available to the senses and available as an experience. Because obviously one of the problems of the contemporary science is that it's so incredibly complex, and it requires such an amount of time to be initiated into, that most of us can't really take on the concept in any meaningful way. And what I was very interested in was how one could draw down these concepts into a realm which would introduce them to non-experts, so that you could actually experience the concept. And I was interested in what role artists had to play in that process. So at a certain point, it became an idea to bring these two people together and to address this question of how artists and artwork can dramatise abstract concepts and allow them to be grasped by non-experts. And this is what we've been discussing and working on this week, in a process that's been intense, very exciting, sometimes frustrating, sometimes enlightening, and sometimes quite humorous. And I think the main conclusion we drew during the early part of the week was that this was a very flawed question. But I think the flaws in the question have been very productive, in fact. The process of working out what was wrong with this question suggested new questions, and kind of opened up this process in between Conrad and Matthew, in which we could examine in more depth what artists and scientists have in common in their way of looking at the world, and the tensions that emerge when they try to communicate. So I'm not sure whether we answered the question, but we certainly ended up producing a lot more problems which I think are very fertile and very important questions in several different ways, which I hope we'll discuss. So I'd like to show you a video which will give you some taster of what's been happening during the week. Unfortunately, the sound quality isn't great because this is an archive video that we've been filming constantly during the week. but I hope you'll get some kind of taste of the process that's gone on. You have the lights on.
Has Conrad ever tried to do? Have you ever tried to make a piece that was which the purpose of which was to allow the viewer to grasp an abstract idea?
I think that they are. I mean, essentially, there are these, but there are these elements in them, but they aren't rigorous academic approaches to something, and they are. And I accept that they're physical renders of ideas that aren't necessarily incredibly rigorous or empirical or mathematical. It maybe isn't, and it isn't necessarily that concerned with the fact that it may not be entirely correct. It's just responding imaginatively to, as a child, to this sort of to those sort of ideas, rather than trying to get too rigorous.
Explanatory.
But I think there's also the question of whether the motives of the artist or the philosopher.
It's certainly a dramatization of the notion of a feedback loop.
Yeah.
But the feedback of the number system onto itself it's difficult to. It would be difficult to dramatise in that sort of way, because it's the role of time that's problematic here. It requires almost a sort of virtual time for it to happen in.
I made something when I was 18, just from when I was playing around. This, you would just feed the information here to a secondary monitor, a much bigger monitor, that would be near the dance floor or something. So that would be feeding the room over here, so everyone in the other room, in the main room, could see without the camera being in front of it.
Oh yeah.
The systems, you'd have this sort of floating orb. It was called the floating orb of fractal chaos. But is that some similar problem of when you stare at your own eyes in the mirror, in the kind of way that you will perceive yourself inside yourself, and then you're looking, it's that sort of narcissist moment that you're having to create a kind of infinite feedback of yourself within your own head.
But the more and less, the fluctuation of sometimes you get great clusters of primes and sometimes you get great arid deserts of none. And it's the fluctuation of the actual behaviour of the thing around its norm which is interesting, and that's where those waves I showed you come in.
I think that's why David Robbins sort of put us together, is that you're not in that academic world, in that sort of scientific world, and you're attempting to sort of convey get these ideas across, which I am as well. There's a sort of we have a sort of a kind of similar intent in a way. I mean, yours is more rigorous than mine in the sense that it's not about misinformation, but you are interested in aesthetics in the sense that your book is reliant on aestheticization of these ideas.
Yeah.
And and you are to a certain extent relying on sort of metaphor.
You have to engage the parts of the brain that are tied in with the motor functions.
Yeah.
So, for example, I describe adding numbers by walking a number of steps and then walking another number of steps. I describe this staircase function by walking or actually building these towers of blocks.
Endless blocks is quite a good metaphor for science or for mathematics, or just like a human condition that we're trying to see outside of something that we're really confined by our own senses and that breadth of our sensations.
Why would an artist get involved and dedicate their time to dramatising abstract ideas? Where would that motivation come from?